The Hinterkaifeck Murders. It was the spring of 1922. The last of the snow had melted from the fields of Bavaria, leaving the farmland damp and silent beneath a slate-gray sky. Not far from the village of Grobern, in the rural German countryside, nestled a lonely homestead known as Hinterkaifeck. It was isolated, quiet, resting about a kilometer behind a dense stretch of woods that shielded it from the nearby road. A farmhouse and a barn, built strong and plain in the traditional German style, stood surrounded by fields and stillness. The world outside was changing. Germany was reeling from the aftermath of World War I. But here, at Hinterkaifeck, time seemed to hold its breath. 6 people lived on the farm in 1922. Andreas Gruber, his wife Cecilia, their widowed daughter Victoria Gabriel, and Victoria's 2 children, Cecilia, aged 7, and Josef, just 2 years old. The final member of the household was their maid, Maria Baumgartner, who had only just arrived at the farm on March 31st. She had replaced another maid who had quit 6 months earlier under unsettling circumstances. The old maid had complained of strange sounds, footsteps in the attic, voices in the night. She had said the house felt wrong, haunted. The Grubers had dismissed her fears at first, but Andreas had begun to notice odd things himself. A set of footprints in the snow leading from the forest toward the house, but not away from it. A newspaper that no one in the household remembered buying. A key to the house that vanished without a trace. And then there were the sounds. Muffled steps above the ceilings, whispering behind the walls. Still, they stayed. Life on the farm was hard, and isolation was not unusual in this part of the country. Perhaps it was easier to pretend the oddities were nothing at all. But they were not nothing, because just days after Maria arrived, all 6 members of the household were dead. It wasn't until April 4th, 4 days later, that concerned neighbors and townsfolk ventured onto the property. The postman had noticed that no one had collected the mail. Victoria hadn't shown up to church. The children had missed school. There was no smoke from the chimney, no sounds of animals, no signs of life. What they found inside the barn would linger in the minds of everyone who saw it, long after the police had gone and the crowds had left. Stacked one atop the other, half covered in hay, were the bodies of Andreas, Cecilia, Victoria, and little Cecilia. Each one had been killed with a brutal blow to the head. Inside the farmhouse, in the cramped maids' quarters, they found Maria Baumgartner, dead on the floor. In his cot, the youngest child, Joseph, was also gone, murdered in his sleep. No valuables had been stolen. The animals had been fed. A fire had recently been lit in the hearth. Someone had lived in the house after the murders. Someone had tended the cattle, eaten meals, perhaps even slept in the family's beds. The case that followed became one of the most infamous unsolved murders in German history. No one was ever charged. No one was ever arrested. Theories abounded, some plausible, some bizarre, but no answers ever came. Today, over a century later, the Hinterkaifeck murders remain a chilling mystery. A ghost story rooted not in fiction, but in fact. A true account of brutality in a quiet, forgotten corner of the world. As you listen tonight, we'll walk together through every known detail. We'll revisit the events leading up to the tragedy, examine the scene through the eyes of the investigators, and trace the web of suspects and unanswered questions that followed. But take care. This is not a tale of vengeance, nor of justice served. It is a story with no ending. A mystery left to rot beneath the earth, where once a farm stood silent, and someone was watching from the attic. To understand the tragedy that would unfold at Hinterkaifeck, we first need to understand the people who lived there. The head of the household was Andreas Gruber. Born in 1859, Andreas was a stern, deeply conservative man in his 60s by 1922. Neighbors described him as harsh, not particularly friendly, and often cruel. There were whispers around Groburn that Andreas had a violent temper. Some even claimed he beat his family. He was a farmer by trade, one who valued routine, order, and control. His wife, Cecilia Gruber, born in 1850, was quieter and more reserved. She had spent decades beside Andreas, raising a family and working the land. By all accounts, she kept mostly to herself and said little in public. People rarely saw her without Andreas nearby. Their daughter, Victoria Gabriel, was in her mid-30s and had been widowed in the First World War. Her husband, Carl Gabriel, had reportedly died on the battlefield in France in 1914, though that part of the story would later become a point of strange controversy. Victoria remained on the farm after Carl's death and helped with the labor. She sang in the local church choir and was, by contrast to her parents, well liked in the village. But there were disturbing rumors surrounding Victoria as well. Rumors that darkened the image of the Gruber household in the eyes of the villagers. In 1915, Andreas and Victoria were both convicted of incest, and each served time in prison. Victoria received 1 month, while Andreas was sentenced to a year. The circumstances behind the conviction were murky and uncomfortable. Many believed Andreas had continued to abuse Victoria for years. Others claimed their relationship was consensual, something even more disturbing to those of the village. And then there was Joseph, Victoria's young son, born in 1919. Officially, Joseph's father was unknown. Victoria had claimed at times that he was the child of a local man named Lorenz Schlittenbauer, but Lorenz denied paternity. Others suspected Joseph may have been the result of continued abuse by Andreas. To this day, no one knows the truth. Victoria's older child, also named Cecilia, was 7 years old at the time of the murders. She was bright, cheerful, and loved to talk to the neighbors. Unlike the rest of the family, young Cecilia was often seen playing outside, greeting passers-by on the path between the village and the farm. Hers was the most innocent presence in the house. And finally, there was Maria Baumgartner, the new maid, who arrived on March 31st, the same day the murders are believed to have occurred. Maria was 44 years old. She'd taken the job reluctantly after hearing about the strange events from the previous maid. Her sister had accompanied her to the farm that morning and left just hours before the killings. Altogether, they formed a family, shrouded in secrecy and silence. To the people of Groburn, the Grubers were distant, cold even. Despite their decades in the community, few villagers truly knew them. They kept to themselves, rarely invited guests, and let little slip beyond the farm's borders. The Gruber farm itself was not small. Hinterkaifeck, so named because of its location behind the town of Kaifeck, was remote, surrounded by woods and fields. It included a farmhouse, a barn, and several outbuildings. Though it wasn't unusual for rural families to live in such isolation, the Grubers' separation from the village seemed deeper, less about geography and more about something unspoken. And so, when strange things began to happen at Hinterkaifeck, no one was entirely surprised. No one, it seemed, had ever felt completely comfortable there. It started in the weeks leading up to the murders. A strange newspaper appeared in the house, one that no one had purchased. Footprints were discovered in the snow leading to the house from the nearby forest, but none leading back out. Keys went missing. Sounds came from the attic, scratching, whispering, steps. But when Andreas searched, he found no one. The old maid had quit abruptly, claiming she feared the house. Victoria told friends she believed someone was watching them. Even little Cecilia mentioned odd sounds in the night. But none of it was reported to the police. Perhaps Andreas feared embarrassment. Perhaps he didn't believe the threat was real. Or maybe, just maybe, he knew something he wasn't willing to admit. And then, in the span of a single day, everyone in the house was gone. The entire family, silenced, bludgeoned, left to rot in the barn and beds where they had lived their last quiet hours. Whoever did it knew the house, knew the routines, knew the layout. Someone had come, not in anger, not in haste, but with planning. And after the blood was spilled, they stayed. As the long winter of 1922 gave way to spring, the land surrounding Hinterkaifeck remained quiet. But inside the house, unease had begun to spread like frost creeping through the floorboards. It began with a newspaper. One morning in March, Andreas Gruber reportedly discovered a copy of the Münchener Neueste Nachrichten, a paper published in Munich. It was laid out in the house as though someone had been reading it. But none of the Grubers subscribed to that paper. No one in the family had purchased it. They asked their neighbors, and no one else had left it there. At first, it seemed harmless, perhaps a simple mix-up, maybe something blown in from a cart. But in hindsight, it was the first unsettling sign. Then came the footprints. In the final days of March, the fields around the farm were still dusted with snow. Andreas noticed something strange while out, tending to the property. A single trail of footprints leading from the nearby woods toward the house, passing through the yard, and stopping. There were no return tracks, no indication that the person had ever left. He searched the outbuildings. He checked the barn. He even climbed into the attic, but he found nothing. And yet, the sounds in the ceiling, footsteps overhead, persisted, as if someone was still up there, moving when the house fell silent. Around the same time, a set of keys vanished from their usual place. Andreas had always kept the house secured, a habit not uncommon in rural regions, despite the distance from town. But now, one of the keys was gone. At first, he thought perhaps Victoria had misplaced it, or that Maria, the incoming maid, might have used it. But no one had touched the keys. No one could explain the disappearance. In the village of Gröbern, murmurs had already begun to spread. The family at Hinterkaifeck had always been seen as strange, and now, with Victoria's quiet anxiety and Andreas's unusual behavior, people began to wonder if something darker was happening on that farm. Victoria confided in several people that she feared someone was watching them. She had even mentioned to friends at church that she heard breathing in the walls at night. The idea was terrifying, but Victoria was not prone to flights of imagination. Those who knew her said she was grounded, practical. If she was afraid, there was a reason. And then there was the former maid. She had left the household about 6 months earlier, in late 1921. When questioned later by police, she revealed she had quit because she believed the farm was haunted. She heard whispers and footsteps when no one was around. she felt watched. At night, she had heard someone moving in the attic, but every time Andreas went to investigate, he found nothing. Her departure hadn't been a surprise to the locals. Servants didn't last long at Hinterkaifeck. The house was too quiet, the family too strange. The air inside was said to feel heavy. But when Maria Baumgartner, the new maid, arrived on March 31st, she likely had no idea of the fear that had settled into the bones of the house. She was escorted to the property by her sister, who stayed only a short while before leaving her alone in the care of the Grubers. That very night, they were all killed. The exact timeline of the murders remains uncertain. What we know is based on details reconstructed after the bodies were discovered. Authorities believe that the murders began in the barn. The killer, or killers, lured members of the family one by one into the darkened structure, possibly using the animals or a noise to draw them out. Once inside, they were killed with a mattock, a tool similar to a pickaxe used for digging and farming. It was heavy, blunt, and deadly. First was likely Andreas, then Cecilia, followed by Victoria, and finally young Cecilia. All were struck in the head, violently. Their skulls were shattered, their bodies dragged into a pile and covered loosely with hay and an old door. Inside the house, the killer then moved to the maid's quarters, where Maria had only just unpacked her things. She was murdered in her room, her body left beside her bed. And finally, Joseph, only 2 years old, was killed in his crib. But the most chilling detail of all was this. Someone remained in the house for days after the killings. When townspeople eventually entered the property, they noticed signs of fresh cooking in the hearth. The cows had been fed. The dog had been moved between the barn and the house. Blankets had been disturbed. The beds slept in. Food eaten. The killer, or killers, had not only committed one of the most gruesome crimes in German history, they had lived in the house afterward, among the bodies. One neighbor passing by days later noticed smoke rising from the chimney, even though no one had been seen since March 31st. Another claimed they saw someone in the yard walking slowly among the animals. To this day, no one knows who it was. The murders were not a crime of passion. They were not the result of a robbery gone wrong. Nothing was taken. The killer came prepared. They brought the weapon. They knew the layout. They waited in secret for the right moment. And when it was over, they stayed. The final movements of the Gruber family in those last days remain mysterious. Why did Andreas not report the missing key? Why did no one notify the authorities about the strange footprints? What did Victoria truly believe was happening? And why, most disturbingly, did no one run? Why didn't anyone scream? There were neighbors within earshot. Yet no one heard a sound on the night of March 31st. The silence was total, as if the house had swallowed them whole. By April 4th, 1922, the silence at Hinterkaifeck had become too loud to ignore. The people of Grobern were used to the Gruber family's reclusive habits, but something felt off. The mail had begun to pile up. Young Cecilia hadn't appeared at school. Victoria was missing from choir practice, a routine she rarely skipped. Even the animals at Hinterkaifeck, usually tended to with precision, had begun to cry out. Albert Hoffner, a mechanic, was one of the first to act on the unease. He had been scheduled to visit the farm on April 4th to repair a piece of farm equipment, a feeding machine. When he arrived, he found the entire property eerily still. He knocked. No answer. He called out. Nothing. The dog barked, but no one came. What struck him was not just the quiet, it was the sense of abandonment. And yet, something wasn't right. The barn doors were closed, the windows shuttered. But he could hear faint noises inside, the animals restless, the dog whining. He waited for hours, hoping someone would return. Eventually, unsettled and unable to do his job, he left. Later that day, neighbors returned with him, this time with a small group, including Lorenz Schlittenbauer, a neighbor and former suitor of Victoria, who would become a controversial figure in the days ahead. When the group arrived at the farm, they did what Hoffner had not. They forced their way into the barn. The smell hit them first. Inside the barn, they discovered a gruesome sight beneath the hay. 4 bodies stacked atop one another in a disorderly pile. Blood soaked the straw. Flies swarmed. It was clear the victims had been dead for several days. The victims were quickly identified. Andreas, Cecilia, the elder, Victoria, and little Cecilia, just 7 years old. Each had suffered massive trauma to the head, likely inflicted with a heavy, blunt object. Their faces were almost unrecognizable. Victoria's skull had been crushed so violently that part of her brain was exposed. Young Cecilia's face was caked with dried blood. Clumps of her hair had been torn out, possibly from her own hand, suggesting she had lived for some time after the attack. Perhaps hours, perhaps longer. The investigators moved into the house, where the horror deepened. In the maid's room, they found Maria Baumgartner, still in her dress, lying dead on the floor. Her suitcase sat nearby, unopened. Her face was streaked with blood, and a bed sheet had been thrown over her, as if in a mockery of modesty. In a small bedroom nearby, Joseph was found dead in his cot. He, too, had suffered a brutal blow to the head. He had been tucked under one of his mother's skirts. No one was left alive. Authorities from nearby Munich arrived to investigate. Led by Inspector Georg Reingruber, the police began the long and difficult task of unraveling what had happened on the remote farm. What they found only deepened the mystery. The killer had taken great care in covering the bodies. Straw and boards had been placed deliberately. The murder weapon, later identified as a mattock, a kind of heavy hoe with a pick-like end, was nowhere to be found. There were no signs of forced entry. Nothing was stolen. Money, jewelry, even Victoria's savings, still hidden in a drawer, had been left untouched. But the strangest detail, and perhaps the most terrifying, was this. Someone had lived in the house after the murders. The cows had been milked. The dog had been fed. Someone had eaten meals, warmed themselves by the fire, and cared for the animals. Neighbors reported smoke from the chimney in the days following the killings. One woman claimed she saw a figure at the edge of the woods, watching. All this suggested the killer did not flee immediately. They stayed. They walked the same halls, slept in the same beds, lived with the dead. Then came another discovery. A secret compartment was found in the attic, small but large enough to conceal a person. Straw had been laid there, as if someone had been nesting. Police believed it was possible the killer had been living in the attic for days, perhaps even weeks, before the murders, watching the family below, waiting for the right moment to strike. There were no fingerprints, no clear clues. The few muddy boot prints they found were smudged and overlapping. The snow that might have preserved them had melted. Reingruber ordered photographs and autopsies, which were performed disturbingly on the property itself. In a crude, makeshift operation, the heads of the victims were removed for analysis. They were sent to Munich in hopes of gaining more insight. But fate had one last cruelty in store. During World War II, the skulls were lost, misplaced or destroyed in the chaos of the Allied bombings. To this day, they have never been recovered. The victims of Hinterkaifeck are buried in the nearby cemetery without their heads. In the aftermath, the farmhouse was dismantled, torn down later in 1923. Locals said it had become cursed. No one wished to live where such evil had occurred. The barn, the rooms, the attic, all reduced to rubble. But the memories remained. The village whispered for years afterward, speculating, accusing, fearing. No one ever confessed. No one was ever convicted. To this day, the Hinterkaifeck murders remain unsolved. And the question lingers, like the wind through the trees. Who lived in the attic? The crime scene at Hinterkaifeck was unlike anything investigators had encountered before. Isolated, gruesome, and chillingly intimate, it held a sinister weight, like the house itself had absorbed the violence and refused to let it go. From the moment the bodies were discovered on April 4th, 1922, Inspector Georg Reingruber and his team were met with confusion. No murder weapon, no obvious motive, and most unnervingly, no signs of forced entry. Let's walk together, room by room, through what was found, because in the stillness of Hinterkaifeck's aftermath, every detail matters. The barn. The barn was connected to the main house by a small passageway, a common design in Bavarian farms, meant to allow access to livestock in harsh weather. It was here, in the dim, hay-strewn space beneath the rafters, that 4 bodies were found. They had been killed one by one, investigators believed. Lured out, perhaps by a sound or by suspicion. Andreas may have gone first. He was the most likely to check on the animals. Victoria may have followed. Then, young Kazilia, and finally, the elder Kazilia. The killer had hidden just out of sight in the darkened barn, waiting with a mattock, a farming tool sharp and heavy enough to split bone. Each victim was struck in the head with deadly force. The wounds were brutal, skulls shattered, faces torn open. Victoria's head had been hit repeatedly, with a ferocity that suggested something more than just murder, something personal. Their bodies were stacked atop one another, awkwardly and without care. The killer then covered them with hay and an old barn door. It wasn't to preserve them. It wasn't out of guilt. It seemed more ritualistic, a crude attempt to conceal, but not to hide. On one of the beams overhead, blood spatter marked the ceiling. The killer had swung upward with so much strength that the blood flew in a high arc. The weapon was never found. Maria's room. In the house, the first body they found was Maria Baumgartner, the maid. She had only been employed for a single day. Her suitcase, partially unpacked, sat near her bed. She had been bludgeoned like the others, likely while still getting settled. Her body was covered with a bedsheet. Whether this was an act of modesty or cold practicality, no one could say, but it indicated the killer was calm, unrushed, someone who felt secure enough to linger. She had not been lured to the barn. She had been hunted down inside the house. Joseph's bedroom. In the next room, Joseph, the 2-year-old child, lay in his crib. His small body had been covered with one of Victoria's skirts. The killer had approached the crib quietly and struck him while he slept. He was the last to die. His death, like the others, wasn't a side effect of a robbery. No valuables were taken, no items disturbed. Joseph's murder was intentional. There are some who believe he was the primary target. The kitchen and common rooms. Investigators found signs of recent meals prepared in the kitchen. Plates still held crumbs of bread and meat. A kettle had been warmed over the fire. The hearth was hot, suggesting someone had lit it not long before the neighbors arrived. The killer had not simply killed and fled. They had made themselves at home. Beds appeared to have been slept in. Blankets were turned down. The dog had been moved between buildings. Livestock had been fed and milked. The household continued, quietly, for several days after the family was dead. It was as though the killer had assumed the role of the Grubers, eating their food, tending their animals, living among their remains. The neighbors were horrified. The attic. Then came one of the most chilling discoveries. Above the ceilings of the main house was a small attic space, accessible only by ladder. Inside, police found evidence that someone had been sleeping in the attic, long before the murders took place. There were depressions in the straw, like a person had lain there. Crumbs from food, an old piece of cloth. There was even a small viewing hole, carved or worn through the wood, where someone could peer down into the rooms below. It's believed the killer had lived in the attic for days, maybe weeks, watching the family from above, learning their habits, waiting for the right moment. The idea is enough to make the blood run cold. Other clues. A strange lock of hair was found near one of the bodies, possibly torn out in a struggle, though it didn't appear to match anyone in the household. A neighbor claimed he saw someone at the edge of the forest days after the killings, a man, tall and unmoving, just watching. A local dog breeder had sold a new leash to someone matching Andreas's description a week earlier. But Andreas already owned a leash. Was it someone impersonating him? The murder weapon was nowhere to be found at the time. It would be discovered over a year later, rusting in the attic of a nearby outbuilding, but police could never conclusively prove it was the weapon. Despite these clues, the scene held more questions than answers. Why didn't the victims cry out? Neighbors were close enough to hear gunshots or screams, yet no one reported hearing a thing. Did the killer know how to silence them quickly? Or was fear enough to keep them quiet? How did the killer move between rooms so freely? Was it someone they knew? Someone trusted? A family member? A neighbor? And why the deliberate calm afterward? It wasn't just a crime of opportunity. It was premeditated, controlled, personal. The police tried everything: fingerprinting, door-to-door interviews, even psychics were consulted. But no one came forward, no one confessed. And as the days turned into weeks, the trail grew cold. The rooms of the farmhouse echoed with silence, and outside, the land began to reclaim the blood-soaked soil. In time, even the house itself was torn down, reduced to rubble and memory. All that remains now is a small memorial cross where the barn once stood, and the haunting echoes of a crime that has never been solved. When news of the murders at Hinterkaifeck spread, the public response was immediate and intense. The Bavarian police, overwhelmed by the brutality of the case, began their investigation on April 5, 1922, under the leadership of Inspector Georg Reingruber, who had traveled from Munich to take charge. The scene he encountered was unlike anything he'd ever seen. But despite the horror, there were few immediate leads, no clear suspect. no motive. And yet, someone had taken 6 lives and lived among the corpses. As news spread, dozens of investigators and curious townspeople swarmed the property. Some simply wanted to see the infamous crime scene. Others, perhaps more earnestly, hoped to help. But the crowding had a consequence. The crime scene was heavily contaminated. Footprints overlapped. Evidence was moved. By the time serious forensic analysis could begin, much of what could have been useful was already lost. Early suspicions. The first person to fall under scrutiny was Lorenz Schlittenbauer, a neighbor of the Grubers and a former lover of Victoria. Lorenz had once claimed to be the father of her son, Joseph, but later denied it when legal issues over child support arose. Still, his connection to the family and his behavior on the day the bodies were discovered raised suspicions. It was Lorenz who led the neighbors into the barn, and it was Lorenz who unlatched doors and entered rooms with an unsettling familiarity. Some claimed he showed no real emotion. Others thought he seemed too comfortable walking through a house filled with the murdered. He even moved Joseph's body, an act the police later found suspicious. Lorenz explained that he was trying to help, but his actions led many to believe he knew more than he admitted. Police questioned him repeatedly, and in later years, private investigators would continue to probe his story. But there was never enough evidence to charge him. Theories begin to form. Without a clear suspect, the police began assembling theories, many of them as unsettling as the crime itself. A vengeful lover or scorned suitor. One possibility was that someone close to Victoria, possibly Lorenz or another unnamed lover, had discovered the family secrets. The incestuous relationship between Victoria and her father was widely rumored, and perhaps someone who loved her had snapped, killing them all in a jealous or righteous rage. A robbery. Gone wrong. This theory was quickly dismissed. Nothing had been stolen. The house's valuables, including a large sum of money Victoria had hidden away, remained untouched. A family member seeking revenge. Some suspected Carl Gabriel, Victoria's husband, who was believed to have died in the war. There were whispers, though never confirmed, that he had survived and returned in secret. Could he have found his wife living with her father and an illegitimate child and exacted revenge? But no credible evidence supported the idea that Carl had survived. Most historians consider this theory unlikely, though it still surfaces in speculative discussions today. A drifter or escaped convict. Another theory posited that the killer was a stranger, someone passing through, perhaps hiding in the woods. The footprints, the attic bedding, the careful timing, all could support the idea of someone camping near the property, studying the family's habits, and striking when the moment was right. Still, the sheer familiarity with the layout of the home, the calm after the murders, and the deliberate targeting of each person made this seem less likely. Psychics and unconventional methods. In a sign of desperation, the authorities turned to unorthodox means. A clairvoyant was invited to the property. She claimed to see visions of the murders and named a supposed killer, but offered no concrete proof. In the following months, dozens of letters and anonymous tips flooded the police station. Some named individuals from nearby towns. Others claimed the house was cursed. Every lead was followed. None led anywhere. The autopsies. The victims' autopsies were conducted on site, in the barn where 4 of the bodies were found. A village doctor performed the grim procedure, and the heads of the victims were removed and sent to Munich for forensic analysis. It was hoped that the skulls would provide insight into the weapon used or the angle of attack, but nothing definitive was found. Years later, in a tragic twist, the skulls were lost during World War II, likely destroyed in the Allied bombings. This left the family's remains incomplete and a key piece of evidence gone forever. The mattock is found. In 1923, a year after the murders, the police made a chilling discovery. Hidden in an old outbuilding near the property was a mattock, rusted, blood-stained, and consistent with the wounds found on the victims. It had been hidden under floorboards, wrapped in cloth. For many, this was confirmation that the killer had known the property well. They had known where to stash the weapon. Perhaps they had lived nearby or even visited the farm before. Still, even with the weapon in hand, no suspects were conclusively linked to it. No fingerprints, no DNA, just blood and rust and silence. The investigation stalls. Over the months that followed, the investigation lost momentum. No charges were filed, no arrests were made. Dozens of suspects were interviewed. Theories were mapped out on paper, but each road led to a dead end. And the truth, whatever it was, remained buried beneath the dirt floor of the barn. A case that haunts. Over the decades that followed, the Hinterkaifeck case would continue to fascinate and disturb. Criminologists have studied it. Journalists have written about it. Internet forums discuss it in obsessive detail. But none have come closer to solving the mystery than Reingruber and his men did in 1922. The official investigation was closed in 1955, more than 3 decades after the murders. It remains, to this day, one of the most infamous unsolved cases in German history. And in the silence of the fields outside Kaifeck, there are those who say that nothing ever truly left the farm, that something lingered, that the story isn't finished. As the investigation into the Hinterkaifeck murders stalled, a new phase began, one driven by speculation, suspicion, and fear. Without evidence to clearly point to one person, everyone became a suspect. Over the years, police, journalists, and armchair detectives have scrutinized dozens of individuals. Some were family, some were neighbors, some were strangers who simply passed through. All of them, in some way, fit part of the mystery, but none have fit the whole. 1. Lorenz Schlittenbauer, the neighbor with secrets. The most frequently cited suspect in the case is Lorenz Schlittenbauer, the Gruber's neighbor and the man who led the group that discovered the bodies. Lorenz had a complicated history with the family. He had once courted Victoria Gabriel, and for a time he claimed to be the father of her son, Joseph. But after her demands for child support intensified, he retracted his paternity claim. Their relationship turned bitter. Victoria allegedly told others that Joseph's real father was her own father, Andreas Gruber, a possibility made more sinister by the fact that Andreas and Victoria had once been jailed for incest. Lorenz had a clear motive: revenge, jealousy, shame. He also had opportunity. He knew the layout of the farm. He had access to the property. He lived nearby. And his behavior on the day the bodies were discovered was unusual. Eyewitnesses claimed that Lorenz was strangely calm. He walked through the house with confidence, even unlocking doors without a key. He moved bodies, disturbed the scene, and when asked, he offered vague answers. Years later, Lorenz sued a newspaper for labeling him the killer. The court sided with him, and he was never officially charged. But to this day, many believe he was the one who climbed into the attic, who watched, who waited, and who struck. 2. A vagrant or escaped criminal, the stranger in the attic. One theory suggests that the killer was a drifter, someone passing through the Bavarian countryside. The idea fits with a number of eerie facts. The footprints in the snow, leading to the house, but not away. The nest found in the attic, straw, crumbs, and signs of someone watching from above. The calculated nature of the attack, someone with no emotional ties, just cold observation. There were no witnesses, no known visitors. But in the days before the murders, the Grubers had complained of noises overhead. Victoria had confided that she believed someone was living in the house with them. The previous maid had said the same. It's possible that someone had broken in weeks earlier, hiding in the attic, moving only at night, waiting. But if that were true, why would the killer stay afterward? Feed the animals? Cook meals? That behavior suggested familiarity, not randomness. This theory answers some questions, but raises others. 3. Carl Gabriel, the husband, returned from the dead. By all official records, Carl Gabriel, Victoria's husband, died in World War I in 1914. His body was never recovered, but that was not unusual at the time. War was chaotic. Many soldiers were lost without formal burial. But after the murders, rumors spread through Groburn and beyond. What if Carl had survived? Some suggested he had returned to find Victoria living with her abusive father, and possibly bearing his child. The thought might have driven him to madness. There were unconfirmed reports of soldiers saying they had seen Carl alive after the war, under a different name, perhaps suffering from trauma. Others speculated he might have faked his death to escape his past. The theory suggests that Carl returned to Hinterkaifeck, hidden, enraged by what he found. That he took revenge, slowly, methodically. But again, there is no evidence, no known photographs, no fingerprints, and no confirmed sightings of Carl after the war. This theory lives mostly in folklore, a ghost story of a man returned to punish those who wronged him. 4. The Grubers. Themselves. A crime born of the household. Some theorists argue that the answer was inside the house all along. What if Andreas Gruber himself killed the others in a fit of rage or madness and then took his own life? This would explain the brutality, the personal nature of the killings, the deliberate order of events. But it fails in a crucial way. Andreas was found dead in the barn, stacked with the others. No gun, no note, no mechanism for suicide. Could Victoria have killed the family and then herself? Unlikely, given her own wounds. She was bludgeoned like the others. Some even speculate that young Cecilia may have witnessed the murders and clawed at her head in terror or agony. Her hair was found torn out post-mortem, but she, too, had been struck down. In the end, there's no version of this theory that accounts for the continued life in the home afterward. Someone stayed, slept, ate, and the Grubers were all dead. 5. Multiple killers, a coordinated attack. Another theory. This was no lone wolf. Perhaps more than one person was responsible. A coordinated attack involving locals who wanted the Grubers gone. Motive? The incest conviction had made the family social outcasts. Andreas was despised by many. Victoria had pressured multiple men for support and money. Perhaps someone snapped. With more than one person, it would be easier to lead each victim into the barn without alarming the others. One distracts, the other kills. Repeat. A group could also more easily control the animals, stage the house, and leave unseen. This theory holds weight in practicality, but it lacks direct evidence. No second set of footprints, no confessions, no credible group ever tied to the farm. Still, in a village where secrets were buried deep, who's to say? 6. A copycat, or imitator. The theatrical killer. Some have suggested that the killer had no personal connection to the family at all, but was instead drawn to the farm by the opportunity to enact a fantasy. Living in the attic, watching, killing, staying. The crime was almost theatrical, ritualistic, the stacking of bodies, the calm afterward. It suggested not just rage, but intention. In modern criminal profiling, this might be called a mission-oriented killer, someone who believes they are cleansing, correcting, or fulfilling a twisted personal narrative. Perhaps the killer had read about the Grubers, traveled far, stalked them. Again, the lack of theft, the feeding of animals, the patience. If this were the case, the killer may have vanished without a trace, never to kill again. A single performance, a perfect stage. Final thoughts. In the years following the Hinterkaifeck murders, over 100 people were interviewed, including vagrants, soldiers, ex-servants, and distant family. None were charged. No confession was ever made. And each theory, no matter how plausible, leaves unanswered questions. Who had the time and nerve to stay in a house full of corpses? Why feed the animals? Why light the fire? Who could move without being seen and disappear without a trace? The woods around Hinterkaifeck have grown since then. The fields remain quiet, but somewhere, buried in memory, in silence, in time, lies the truth. And after more than a century, it still refuses to come to light. Even after months of investigation and decades of speculation, the case of Hinterkaifeck remains maddeningly elusive. The deeper one looks, the more the case resists clarity. It is a puzzle with too many corners, too many missing pieces, and too much silence in between. In this chapter, we'll examine the most puzzling clues, those strange details that still baffle criminologists, historians, and true crime enthusiasts to this day. They are the breadcrumbs left behind, the ghostly footprints that vanish mid-step. 1. The footprints in the snow. One of the earliest and most unsettling clues came before the murders ever took place. In late March of 1922, Andreas Gruber discovered a single set of footprints in the freshly fallen snow, leading from the nearby woods directly to the house. There were no return prints, no signs that the person had ever left. He searched the property. Nothing. The footprints were real. Multiple witnesses confirmed them. They were deep, clean, and unmistakably human. So who made them? A vagrant or drifter? Someone hiding in the attic? A neighbor using a secret path? And why didn't Andreas report them to police? Was it pride? Was it fear? Or did he already know who the prints belonged to? 2. The missing house key. Not long after the footprints were found, one of the house keys vanished. The Gruber family had always kept their home secured, particularly after the old maid quit under strange circumstances. But this missing key was never found. even after the murders. Could the killer have stolen it, or was it given to them? This small detail takes on enormous weight when paired with the other strange events leading up to the crime. Noises in the attic, misplaced objects, the newspaper no one bought. Someone had access to the house, and they didn't need to break in. 3. The newspaper that didn't belong. Sometime in March, the family discovered a copy of the Münchener Neueste Nachrichten, a local newspaper that none of them subscribed to. It was left neatly folded in the house, as though someone had been reading it. No one could explain it. No delivery route extended that far out. None of the family had been to town that week. The previous maid had warned of objects moving on their own, tools not where she left them, items appearing or disappearing. Was the newspaper another sign of an intruder already living in the house? Someone who waited until the family slept before creeping down from the attic to read. The silence. During the murders. One of the most confounding elements of the case is how quiet the murders were. The neighbors were close enough to hear a dog barking, a child laughing, a shout. But on the night of March 31st, no one heard a thing. It's believed the murders began in the barn with Andreas. He was lured out, perhaps by a noise or disturbance. Then came Cecilia, then Victoria, then young Cecilia. One by one, they were killed with a mattock, each blow silent in the thick hay of the barn. But what about the screams? What about the sounds of a struggle? Did fear render them silent? Or did they know their killer and walk willingly into the dark? 5. The feeding of the animals. Perhaps the most disturbing detail in the entire case is what happened after the murders. For nearly 4 days, someone remained at Hinterkaifeck. They fed the livestock, they milked the cows, they cooked meals, and kept the hearth burning. No valuables were taken. No attempt was made to flee. Whoever it was didn't leave immediately. They lived there, alongside the bodies. This suggests deep familiarity with the property and nerves of steel. It was cold in early April. The killer might have needed warmth, but the choice to stay, to care for the animals, to sleep in the family's beds, it wasn't just practical, it was personal. 6. The attic evidence. During the investigation, police found evidence that someone had been living in the attic. Straw bedding, crumbs, and signs of a nest-like arrangement. There was even a peephole, a small slit in the wood that allowed someone to look down into the rooms below. The Gruber family had complained about noises overhead for weeks. The previous maid had quit because of them. Someone had been watching. Was this a serial killer? A stalker? A member of the community with a hidden obsession? And why did they wait so long to strike? 7. The final hours of little Cecilia. When the bodies were discovered, one stood out. 7-year-old Cecilia had defensive wounds not found on the others. Her face was covered in blood, but more haunting, her hair had been torn out by the roots, and clumps of it were still in her hands. The coroner believed she may have lived several hours after the attack, injured, terrified, and alone in the barn beside the bodies of her family. No one knows what she saw, what she heard, what she thought in those final moments. But her death lingers as the most tragic and the most haunting. 8. The lost skulls. In an effort to determine the weapon used, all 6 victims had their heads removed during autopsy and sent to Munich for further examination. For decades, the skulls were stored in evidence. Then came World War II. In the chaos of the Allied bombings, the skulls were lost or destroyed, gone forever. Today, the Grubers are buried without their heads. Their graves sit in a quiet cemetery, the wind rustling the trees above. Even in death, the victims were denied peace. 9. The lack of a motive. No money was taken, no valuables stolen, no letters left behind. This wasn't a robbery. It wasn't an act of desperation. It was deliberate, personal, precise. But why? Was it rage over an affair? Jealousy over a child? Madness? The absence of motive is what gives this case its lasting chill. It wasn't what was taken, it was what was left behind. 10. The passage of time. In the years since the murders, dozens of suspects have been named. Some were exonerated, some simply vanished. And with each passing year, the trail grew colder. Witnesses died, memories faded, records were lost. And the farmhouse, once standing silently behind the woods of Kaifeck, was torn down, its foundation reclaimed by weeds and time. All that remains is a small wooden cross, weathered and bowed, marking the site where 6 lives ended in silence. And so we are left with only questions. Who knew the family well enough to move freely? Who stayed after the killings, feeding the animals and lighting the stove? Who had the patience to live in the attic, listening to their every move? The answers may be gone, but the silence around them is loud. And in that silence, the Hinterkaifeck murders continue to echo, unresolved, untouched, and unbearably close. Some crimes vanish with time, forgotten by all but the families and the lawmen who tried to solve them. Others remain. They fester in the public consciousness, not because of their brutality, but because of their mystery. The Hinterkaifeck murders belong to the latter. More than a century has passed since the events of that cold spring in 1922, yet the case remains one of the most enduring unsolved mysteries in European history. Its chilling details, eerie setting, and utter lack of resolution have made it a touchstone in the true crime community and beyond. A case that Germany never forgot. In Germany, Hinterkaifeck is spoken of with the same reverence and fear as Jack the Ripper or the Black Dahlia in the English-speaking world. It's not just a story of murder, it's a folktale, a ghost story, and a cautionary legend all in one. The very name Hinterkaifeck has become shorthand for the perfect crime, one that happens in secret, leaves no trace, and leaves behind only grief and questions. In the decades following the killings, Germans speculated endlessly about the case. Children whispered about the man in the attic. Locals avoided the spot where the farm once stood. Some said they could still hear the cries of the cattle, days after the murders. Even after the farmhouse was demolished in 1923, people continued to visit the site. Some left flowers, others left stones. A simple wooden cross was eventually placed there, marking the grave of a family, and the site of a story that refuses to rest. Inspiring art, film, and fiction. The Hinterkaifeck murders have inspired films, books, and even podcasts, each trying to piece together the impossible. In 2009, a German film titled Hinterkaifeck was released, loosely based on the case. Though fictionalized, the film drew heavily on the atmosphere of isolation, dread, and uncertainty that surrounded the real events. The story has also made its way into true crime podcasts, documentaries, and YouTube channels, where creators attempt to retell the facts, explore the theories, and recreate the eerie feeling of being alone on that farm, with someone watching from above. Online forums have dissected the case down to the finest detail. Amateur sleuths have proposed everything from time-traveling killers to government cover-ups, but none of it brings the truth any closer. Hinterkaifeck, it seems, is not a case to be solved, but a shadow to be studied. Academic and criminological interest. The case has also become a topic of study in criminology and criminal psychology courses, where it is used to illustrate the limitations of early forensic science, the psychological profile of a patient, calculating killer, the consequences of poor crime scene preservation. Modern investigators look back on the case and wince. Key evidence was moved, footprints were trampled, autopsies were rushed. If the murders had occurred today, with today's technology, it's possible the case might have been solved. But the past cannot be rewritten. And perhaps that's part of why the story lingers. A cultural mirror. Perhaps the most haunting legacy of Hinterkaifeck is what it reflects about human nature. A family living in isolation, secrets behind closed doors, a community that sensed something was wrong but never stepped in. It's not just a story of violence, it's a story of silence, of ignored warnings, of a shadow in the attic that no one wanted to believe was real. The memorial. Today, there is nothing left of the original Hinterkaifeck farm. The land has returned to nature. Grass grows tall, trees sway in the wind. A gravel path cuts through what was once the barn. But near that path stands a wooden cross, weather-worn and quiet. It bears no names, no dates, just a simple message of remembrance. Those who visit the site speak of a strange stillness in the air, a heaviness. Some say it's grief, others say it's fear, and others still say it's simply the weight of the unanswered. As the decades passed, the murders at Hinterkaifeck remained shrouded in silence. But with the rise of modern forensic science and a renewed cultural obsession with unsolved crimes, new efforts emerged, some official, some independent, to revisit the case. Though the farmhouse had long since been demolished, and many of the key witnesses were long dead, a few stubborn truths and unresolved clues continued to beckon investigators from the past into the present. The Cold Case Review, 2007. In 2007, a group of German Police Academy students, working with their criminology professor, undertook a cold case analysis of Hinterkaifeck using modern profiling and investigative methods. Their goal was not to solve the case conclusively, but to determine the most likely scenario given everything we now know about forensics, psychology, and behavioral patterns. They examined known suspect behavior, the crime scene reports, autopsy notes, historical context, witness statements. According to unofficial reports, the group did identify a likely suspect based on motive, opportunity, and known behavioral patterns. But out of respect for the suspect's surviving relatives, who were still alive at the time, the name was never publicly released. This gesture added a fresh layer of mystery. Was it someone already suspected? A family member? A local? Was the answer sitting in the files all along? We may never know. Forensic limitations. One reason the case remains unsolved is simply this. Forensic science in 1922 was primitive. Fingerprinting had only recently become standard practice, and even then, rural police departments lacked the tools to collect, preserve, or analyze evidence properly. There was no DNA testing, no crime scene preservation protocols, no criminal databases to compare prints or patterns. The farm was overrun with visitors before proper examination. Animals moved through the barn. Concerned neighbors trampled snow and pathways. Even if modern investigators returned to the site today, there would be no trace to find. And most tragically, the victims' skulls, which might have provided modern forensic clues, were lost during the chaos of World War II. Modern theories revisited. In light of today's criminal profiling tools, many believe that Lorenz Schlittenbauer still fits the profile of the most likely suspect. He had intimate knowledge of the family and the property. He showed unusual behavior during discovery. He had motive if he believed Joseph was his son, or if he resented Victoria. Others still insist on the stranger in the attic theory, particularly given the evidence of extended surveillance and post-crime occupation. But without hard evidence, modern forensics can only do so much. Digital sleuthing and crowdsourced investigations. The internet has breathed new life into the Hinterkaifeck mystery. Websites, forums, YouTube videos, even collaborative digital timelines have been created by amateur sleuths determined to find the truth. Digitized versions of the original police reports, translated autopsy summaries, and aerial maps of the property have all helped keep the investigation alive in a virtual space. But here, too, we find more questions than answers. Some believe the truth was buried with the farmhouse. Others think it was hidden behind the social taboos of the time: incest, illegitimacy, and community denial. Whatever the case, the modern age has not brought closure. Just a clearer view of the void where the truth should be. In the end, we are left with 6 lives extinguished on a quiet farm at the edge of a forest, and no justice, no answers, only shadows. The Hinterkaifeck Murders are not just a story about violence. They are a story about what hides in plain sight, about secrets buried in silence, about the things people don't say when the walls are too thin and the air too still. The farmhouse is gone. The bodies are buried. The records are worn with age. But the questions remain. Who walked silently through the snow and never walked back? Who fed the animals and lit the fire, surrounded by corpses? Who watched night after night from above? And why? Why did no one hear the cries? Why did no one come? We like to believe that every mystery can be solved, that with enough time, enough evidence, enough effort, the truth will rise. But Hinterkaifeck reminds us that some truths are stolen, hidden, erased. It reminds us that evil doesn't always wear a mask. Sometimes it wears a familiar face. Sometimes it climbs quietly into the attic and waits. And sometimes it never leaves. As you fall asleep tonight, remember, not all ghosts wear sheets. Some walk on 2 feet. Some carry a key. And some, even now, are still watching, through a crack in the wood, waiting for the world to forget what it cannot explain. Good night.